The light inside the gilded cage was a lie. It was a warm amber glow designed to mimic the soft kiss of a perpetual sunset, but it offered no genuine warmth. It was a cold, calculated light, a stage light meant to flatter the shallow and illuminate the expensive. It gleamed off gold-plated fixtures that were already beginning to tarnish, reflected in oversized mirrors that threw back distorted images of people pretending to be more important than they were, and pooled on the polished surface of a mahogany bar that had been imported at great and often mentioned expense. This was Reginald Reggie Vance's kingdom, and from his throne a custom-made leather stool behind the cash register, he surveyed his domain with the puffed chest satisfaction of a minor potentate. Reggie was a man built from a catalog of insecurities, which he wallpapered over with expensive suits, a watch that cost more than a car, and an air of sublime arrogance. He believed he wasn't just selling liquor. He was curating an experience, filtering out the undesirable elements of the city to create a sanctuary for the elite. His smile was a tool, deployed for those whose credit card statements he respected, and it vanished into a sneer for anyone who failed to meet his unspoken criteria. Among those who fell short was his own staff. He treated them like rented furniture, particularly Sarah, a young waitress with eyes that saw far too much. She moved through the manufactured opulence with a quiet efficiency that Reggie mistook for timidity. In reality, it was a shield. Saw the desperation in the loud laughter of the patrons and the hollowness in Reggie's boasts. Tonight, she was feeling the oppressive weight of the place more than usual, air thick with cologne and counterfeit vomit. It was into this carefully constructed illusion of prestige that Marcus Iron Will Thorne walked. He didn't so much enter as a peer, a quiet disruption in the bar's loud frequency. He pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside, letting it swing shut without a sound. He was a man of medium height, built with a dense, compact strength that was evident even under the simple lines of his plain gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed work boots. There was no brand name to signal his worth, no jewelry to announce his status. His presence was his only credential. His face was a landscape of calm, his gaze steady and observant, sweeping the room not with challenge, but with a placid assessment. He moved with an economy of motion, a subtle grace that was entirely at odds with the preening peacocks arranged around the bar. He found an empty stool at the far end of the bar, away from the main clusters of people, a small island of solitude. Sarah approached him, her pen and pad ready. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her professional smile softening into something genuine at his polite nod. "Just a bottle of your local lager, please," Marcus said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and even. "Coming right up," Sarah said, turning away. She felt Reggie's eyes on her back and resisted the urge to shudder. Reggie hated it when his staff engaged in anything that resembled actual human conversation with the customers he deemed fringe. Marcus nursed his beer, taking slow, deliberate sips. He wasn't here to socialize. It had been a long day of navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the VA hospital, and he just wanted a single, quiet hour to decompress before heading home. He watched the reflections in the mirror behind the bar, a silent observer of the theater of vanity. The inciting incident, when it came, was as petty as it was predictable. A man named Todd, whose family money was older and more impressive then. Reggie's newfound wealth was holding court a few seats down, gesticulating wildly to emphasize a punchline that wasn't particularly funny. He swung his arm back, knocking his glass of what he'd loudly called a 25-year-old single malt from its coaster. The amber liquid sloshed over the side, a few insignificant drops landing on the sleeve of Marcus's t-shirt. Todd stopped mid-laugh, his face contorting in theatrical outrage. "Hey, watch it, buddy," he slurred, his voice carrying across the bar. Marcus looked down at the dark spots on his sleeve, then back at Todd. He showed no anger, only a quiet patience. "You bumped into me," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. The correction was a lit match to Todd's alcohol-fueled ego. "What did you say to me?" "This is $100 scotch you just made me spill, you," he stopped, his eyes raking over Marcus's simple attire with open contempt. The unspoken word hung in the air, thick and ugly. Before Marcus could even respond, Reggie was in motion. He slid off his stool, his face a mask of performative concern for his wealthy patron. This was his moment. "Todd, my friend, is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice oozing sycophantic charm as he placed a placating hand on Todd's shoulder. He then turned his gaze on Marcus, and the charm vanished, replaced by an icy hostility. "This guy," Todd pointed a shaky finger at Marcus, "needs to learn some respect. He needs to pay for my drink." Reggie didn't need to hear another word. Saw Marcus a black man in a plain t-shirt and jeans in his mind? A Rolodex of prejudices flipped to the correct card. This man did not belong. He was a weed in a manicured garden. "Sir," Reggie said, the word sir, a weaponized formality. "My client says you caused him to spill his drink. I think it would be best if you apologized and compensated him." Marcus met Reggie's gaze. The bar had gone quiet, the patrons sensing a bit of blood sport. "I did nothing of the sort," Marcus said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "He bumped into me." Reggie's lips tightened into a thin, ugly line. The man's composure was an affront. People like him were supposed to be cowed, apologetic, or belligerent. This quiet dignity was something Reggie couldn't process, and it enraged him. "I'm not going to argue with you," Reggie snapped, his voice rising. "You come in here dressed like you just crawled out from under a car, and you start trouble with my regulars? It's clear you don't belong here. You're lowering the tone of my establishment." Stara, who had witnessed the entire exchange from her station, felt a hot flush of shame and anger. She opened her mouth to speak, to say that it was Todd's fault, but a sharp, warning glare from Reggie silenced her. Her job was her lifeline, and she knew he would fire her without a second thought. "There's no trouble here," Marcus said, placing a few bills on the counter to cover his beer, "but I can see I'm not welcome." "You're damn right you're not," Reggie sneered, emboldened by Marcus's move to leave. He wanted to make an example of him. He wanted to cement his status as the gatekeeper of this exclusive world. He gestured to the bouncer, a hulking man named Frank who was paid to do as he was told without question. Frank showed this. Riff-Raff. ... the door. Frank lumbered forward, but Marcus was already on his feet. He was not a man who needed to be. Shown the door, he paused and looked directly at Reggie, his eyes suddenly holding a weight that seemed to press all the air out of Reggie's lungs. It wasn't a look of anger or fear. It was a look of profound, chilling disappointment. It was the look of a judge gazing upon something utterly contemptible. In that brief moment, Reggie felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: fear. But he quickly smothered it with another layer of arrogance. Marcus turned without another word and walked toward the exit. He didn't slouch. His back was ramrod straight, his steps measured and sure. He pushed the door open and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a bar filled with a sudden, uncomfortable silence. Reggie, misinterpreting the quiet as approval, puffed out his chest and clapped Todd on the back. "Don't worry," he announced. "To the room, the trash has been taken out." From behind the bar, Sarah watched the door swing shut, a single tear of shame tracing a path down her cheek. She knew she had just witnessed something deeply, fundamentally wrong, and she had a terrible feeling that this wasn't over. The night air was cool against Marcus's skin, a welcome antidote to the suffocating atmosphere of the gilded cage. He walked under the inconsistent glow of the streetlights, their hazy halos blurring in the damp air. His footsteps were the only sound in the quiet street, a steady, rhythmic beat on the pavement. There was no hot surge of rage coursing through his veins. He had been in situations where a split second of uncontrolled anger meant the difference between life and death. And he had long ago learned to master that fiery impulse, to pack it away in a cold iron box deep within himself. What he felt was something different, something heavier. It was the weary weight of disappointment. He had faced down enemies in the dusty, sun-scorched landscapes of foreign wars. He had held the hands of dying brothers and promised them their sacrifice would mean something. He had fought, bled, and nearly died for a set of ideals, lofty concepts like freedom, equality, and respect. And tonight, in a dimly lit bar in his own country, those ideals had been casually and cruelly desecrated over a few drops of spilled whiskey.
Oh.
The sheer pettiness of it all was what stung the most. The insult wasn't just to him as a man, but To the uniform he had worn, to the flag he had served, to the very principles he held sacred. His mind, a finely tuned instrument for analysis and control, drifted back. The crisp scent of salt and spray, the biting cold of the Pacific Ocean churning around him. Hell Week, 4th day. His body was a symphony of agony. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and his mind was a fog of exhaustion. They had been in the freezing surf for hours, ordered to link arms and lie back in the churning water until someone quit. Men were shaking uncontrollably, their teeth chattering like castanets. Hypothermia was setting in. One by one, men were crawling out of the water, ringing the brass bell that signaled their surrender. Marcus felt his own resolve starting to fray. But then he heard the voice of his instructor. A young but already legendary officer named Jackson "Jocks" Riley, cutting through the roar of the surf. Pain is temporary. Jocks had bellowed, his voice raw but unyielding. Quitting lasts forever. Find the calm in the center of the storm. Control what's inside, and you can withstand anything on the outside. Self-mastery. Marcus took a deep, shuddering breath, found that quiet center Jocks was talking about, and held the line. He had held the line then, and he had held it tonight. Violence would have been easy. A single, swift motion, and Reggie's arrogant smirk would have been wiped from his face. But that would have been a betrayal of the very discipline Jocks had instilled in him. It would have proven Reggie right. It would have made him the animal Reggie had already decided he was. He stopped walking. An insult of this nature, so deeply rooted in prejudice, could not be left to fester. The screen illuminated his face, his expression grim and resolute. He scrolled through his contacts, a list filled with names that would mean nothing to a man like Reggie, but who represented the most elite fighting force the world had ever known. He found the one he was looking for and pressed the call button. It rang twice before a voice answered, crisp and professional, even at this late hour. Go for Jocks. There was an immediate shift in Jocks' tone. It was no longer just professional. It was personal, laced with the concern reserved for a brother. I'm stateside. In the city, Marcus began, getting straight to the point. The Gilded Cage on 4th Street. He paused, choosing his next words with precision. This wasn't a complaint. It was a report. Encountered a hostile proprietor. It was a situation involving disrespect to the uniform. That was the code. The trigger. Disrespect to the uniform was a phrase that transcended personal insult. It meant that the offense was not just against Marcus Thorne, the civilian, but against what he represented. It was an attack on the ethos of the SEAL teams, an insult to every man who had ever worn the trident. On the other end of the line, Lieutenant Commander Jackson Riley was silent for a moment, but it was a silence filled with a terrifying energy. He understood every nuance of Marcus's message. He could hear the controlled anger, the deep-seated insult that Marcus was too disciplined to express overtly. Understood, Jocks finally said, his voice dropping into a register that was calm, cold, and absolutely lethal. Your location now? Clear. Of the area. I'm fine, Marcus replied. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. It meant, stay put. We're coming. The pack will answer. He didn't know exactly what Jocks would do, but he knew it would be precise, overwhelming, and unforgettable. The storm was no longer gathering. It had been unleashed. Asterisk miles away, in a location that didn't appear on any public maps, Lieutenant Commander Jackson, Jocks Riley, stood in the fluorescent glare of a stark, functional training facility. The air smelled of sweat, steel, and ozone. He lowered his phone, the calm on his face a deceptive mask over the controlled fury building within him. He was family, a man Jocks had personally mentored, whose life he had trusted with his own on more than one occasion. The phrase disrespect to the uniform, coming from a man as stoic as Marcus, was a klaxon horn of alarm. Around him, 6 other members of their team were in various states of post-training cooldown. These were men who existed at the peak of human capability, their bodies honed into lethal instruments, and their minds sharpened by unimaginable pressures. They were a mosaic of America's sons, of farmers, academics. in mechanics, but their individual histories had been forged into a singular identity in the crucible of Bud-S. Basic underwater demolition, SEAL training. They were a brotherhood, bound by a covenant of blood and shared sacrifice. Jocks turned to face them. "Listen up." His voice, though not loud, cut through the ambient noise of the gym like a razor. Every head snapped in his direction. Every conversation stopped. "Just got off the phone with Iron Will," Jock said, using Marcus's call sign. The man put his hands on him, threw him out, targeted him. Low, dangerous murmur went through the group. Their expressions, relaxed moments before, hardened into masks of cold anger. Jocks raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. This wasn't a bar fight. Marcus said it was disrespect to the uniform. You all know what that means. They did. It meant the attack was ideological, was rooted in prejudice against who and what Marcus was, a quiet, professional, black warrior. An insult to his character was an insult to the character of every man in that room. "So," Jocks continued, his eyes moving from man to man, "we are going to pay a visit to this establishment. The Gilded Cage." He let the pretentious name hang in the air for a moment. "But let's be clear on the rules of engagement. This is a non-kinetic operation. We're not going there to break things or to start a fight. We will not raise our voices. We will not make a single threat." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Our presence will be our statement. Our discipline will be our weapon. We are going there to demonstrate solidarity. We're going to have a drink, a glass of water, and we are going to make the owner understand the mistake he made. Is that clear?" A chorus of "hoo-yah" echoed through the gym, a low, resonant confirmation of their understanding and absolute commitment. "Good," Jock said with a curt nod. "Attire is sharp civilian, look sharp, act sharp. 0 dark 30 gear stays packed. Rendezvous at the motor pool in 15 minutes. The team dispersed, moving with a silent, synchronized purpose that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. They went to their lockers, and there were no weapons or combat vests to be seen. Instead, they pulled out crisp, well-fitting jeans, dark button-down shirts, and casual jackets. They were dressing not for a battle, but for a psychological siege. They cleaned up, their movements economical and precise. 15 minutes later, they stood assembled in the motor pool, a formidable phalanx of quiet, coiled strength. They loaded into 3 black, nondescript, but powerful SUVs. The engines purred to life, and the vehicles pulled out onto the road, their movements coordinated as if guided by a single mind. Inside the trucks, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, focused silence. These men could communicate with a glance, a nod, a subtle shift in posture. They were a force of nature, moving with inexorable purpose through the city's glittering veins. A current of cold, hard reality flowing toward a bubble of gilded fantasy. Meanwhile, back at the Gilded Cage, Reggie Vance was at the peak of his smugness. He was leaning against the bar, holding court with Todd and a few other wealthy sycophants, regaling them with an embellished version of the night's events. "You should have seen the look on his face," Reggie bragged, his chest puffed out. He knew he didn't belong here. "I run a tight ship. We don't tolerate any riffraff. You have to maintain standards, you know? It's all about creating a certain ambiance." Sarah, polishing glasses nearby, felt her stomach churn with every word. She looked at the front door, a knot of inexplicable anxiety tightening in her chest. She had a strange feeling, a premonition that the quiet man's departure wasn't an end, but a beginning. She thought of his eyes, the look of profound disappointment that had seemed to pierce right through Reggie's bluster. It was the look of a man who held himself to a higher standard, and who was shocked to find none in others. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the first SUV glide to a silent stop. Just outside the bar's large picture window, the first 2 men who entered the Gilded Cage did so with such quiet purpose that they were almost invisible. They were phantoms slipping through the bar's membrane of noise and narcissism. One was tall and lean, with the sharp features of a hawk. The other was broader, a mountain of quiet muscle. They bypassed the host stand, their eyes doing a quick, almost imperceptible sweep of the room, cataloging exits, threats, and layouts. In a single glance, they moved to the far end of the bar, the very spot Marcus had occupied, and took 2 empty stools. When Sarah approached, the hawk-faced man nodded politely. 2 bottles of still water, please, when you have a moment. His voice was low and calm. Sarah nodded, a little taken aback by their sheer, still intensity. She turned to get the water, and as she did, the front door opened again. The second wave arrived. 2 more men with the same unmistakable aura of disciplined power stepped inside. They paused just inside the door, their gaze sweeping the room. In the opposite direction from the first pair, their eyes briefly met those of their teammates at the bar, in a look so fleeting it was invisible to the uninitiated. Then they moved with silent strides to a vacant booth in the back corner, the one with a clear view of the entire floor. They sat down, their backs to the wall. Reggie, still deep in his self-congratulatory monologue, noticed the new arrivals. Only as potential revenue. "This looks like business is picking up," he said to Todd with a wink. But the atmosphere in the room was already beginning to shift. The ambient chatter, the lifeblood of the bar, began to falter. The loud laughter of a group at a nearby table sputtered out as they became aware of the new presences. It wasn't that the men were doing anything threatening. On the contrary, they were perfectly still. It was their stillness that was so unsettling. They radiated a kind of gravitational pull, a density that warped the light and sound around them. The door opened a third time. The third SUV had disgorged its passengers. 2 more men entered, then another 2 who had seemingly parked down the street. They filtered in, one by one or in pairs, each team occupying a strategic point in the room. A high-top table near the windows, another section of the bar. A small alcove near the restrooms. They didn't speak to one another, didn't look at their phones. They just sat, their hands resting calmly on the tables or their knees. And they watched. Reggie's stream of bragging finally dried up. His smile began to feel stiff on his face. He looked around. His bar was suddenly full, which should have pleased him, but these weren't his usual customers. They weren't loud or flashy or drunk. They were all male, all in superb physical condition, and all exuding an aura of extreme competence. And they were all drinking water. A cold bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He looked from one man to the next, and a dawning, horrifying pattern began to emerge. They were all separate, yet they were all together. A team. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken intent. The remaining patrons had fallen almost completely silent, their eyes darting nervously between Reggie and the silent newcomers who now controlled the space without having raised a single voice. Sarah felt it too, but for her, it wasn't fear. It was awe. She recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same quiet strength she had seen in the man who had been thrown out. It was his calm, his dignity, his coiled power, but magnified by a dozen. She saw a man at a booth give a nearly an invisible nod to a man at the bar, and a jolt of understanding shot through her. They were here for him. The front door opened one last time. One man entered, alone. He was not the biggest of the group, but his presence immediately identified him as the fulcrum upon which all the others balanced. It was Lieutenant Commander Jackson "Jocks" Riley. He moved with a calm, deliberate authority that commanded attention. He didn't scan the room, already knew its composition down to the inch. His focus was singular. He walked directly toward the center of the bar, his path taking him right to a now-trembling Reggie Vance. The silent patrons leaned away, creating a wide circle, a makeshift arena. Jocks stopped directly in front of Reggie, leaving a respectful but unyielding distance between them. The silence in the room was now absolute, a ringing void where only moments before there had been laughter. Jocks looked Reggie directly in the eye. His own eyes were the color of a winter sky and just as cold. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, carrying to every corner of the hushed room with the chilling precision of a sniper's bullet. "Good evening," Jocks said, his tone level and devoid of emotion. "We're here for our friend." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air, letting the weight of them settle onto Reggie's shoulders. "I believe you threw him out last night," Jocks continued, his voice unwavering. His name is Marcus Thorne. Reggie's face, already pale, went completely white. The blood drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. In that single, terrifying moment of recognition, the gilded cage he had so proudly built around himself shattered into a million pieces. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was a terrified man, primal fear in Reggie's mind. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of sneering, superiority, crumbled to dust. He looked past Jox's impassive face, and for the first time saw his bar not as a collection of random customers, but as a flawlessly executed military envelopment. Every man was a watchtower. Every pair of eyes was a searchlight, and they were all fixed on him. The patrons, his once adoring audience, were now just silent witnesses to his impending execution. His mouth went dry, a desert of terror. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, croaking sound emerged. Jax did not gloat. There was no triumph in his expression, only a cold, hard resolve. He was here to deliver a lesson, not to savor a victory. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady instrument of judgment that filled the silent room. Our friend Jax began, his gaze never leaving Reggie's, is a quiet man. He doesn't talk about what he's done, where he's been, or the things he's seen. Men like him, they carry their service in silence, because they know the reality of it is something people like you can't even begin to comprehend. He took a half step closer, and Reggie flinched as if he'd been struck. He has a medal. Jax continued, his voice dropping even lower, drawing everyone in. There's not one he can wear on his chest. It's not one he can show his family. He got it for his actions on a night in a country you've only ever seen on the news, when everything went wrong. He ran toward gunfire that was sending other brave men to the ground. He dragged 3 of his wounded brothers to safety, shielding them with his own body, while a storm of bullets tore the air apart around him. He did this because he believes in the idea of a country where a man can go home, take off his uniform, and be treated with basic human dignity. Jax's voice, which had been purely factual, now took on a razor's edge of contempt. He has bled on foreign soil in defense of the freedoms you enjoy, the freedom to own a business, the freedom to spew your ignorant poison, the freedom to feel safe at night. This man, a man whose boots you are not worthy to polish, walked into your establishment wanting nothing more than a quiet beer. He gestured around the gaudy, overpriced room. And you, in this gilded cage, you judged him. You didn't judge him on the content of his character because you have none of your own to recognize it with. You judged the simplicity of his clothes, judged the color of his skin. You threw away more honor in that single, pathetic moment of arrogance than you will ever earn in your entire, miserable life. Reggie began to stammer, his mind grasping for any excuse. I didn't know. He didn't say who he was. How was I supposed to know? Jax cut him off with a look so sharp it could have flayed skin. He shouldn't have to, he hissed, his voice a whip crack in the silence. His character should have been enough. A man's worth isn't determined by his watch or his wallet. It's measured by his integrity, a concept you are clearly unfamiliar with. As if on a silent, predetermined cue, the front door of the bar swung open. Marcus Thorne stepped inside. The effect was electric. The team members, who had formed a loose, menacing circle around the room, subtly shifted their weight, their positions, their very presence. Without a word being spoken, they created a wide, clear path from the door, directly to the bar. Oh, it was a silent, breathtaking display of honor and respect. They were parting the waters for him. Marcus walked through the corridor of his brothers. He was still in simple civilian clothes, but he now wore an undeniable mantle of authority. Everyone in the room understood the steel that lay beneath it. He came to a stop, beside Jax, forming a united front, and fixed his calm, unwavering gaze on the completely broken man cowering behind the bar. The final confrontation wasn't loud. It was devastatingly quiet. I didn't come back here for an apology, Marcus said, his voice low but carrying a profound weight that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. An apology from you would be worthless. He looked around the room, at the gaudy fixtures and the frightened faces of the patrons. It's not a tax you levy on people you think are beneath you. It's not a privilege you grant to the wealthy. Respect is the bare minimum of human decency, something you must first be willing to give to have any hope of receiving it. Last night you showed everyone here that you have none to give. Jocks held up a single hand, and the babbling stopped. "We don't want your drinks," he said with finality. "We've never wanted anything from you." He turned to the bar. "We're leaving." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $5 bill, placing it gently on the polished mahogany to cover the waters he and his men had ordered. And then a remarkable thing happened. In a single, coordinated, utterly silent movement, every other seal in the room stood up. One by one, they walked forward from their booths and tables. They formed a silent procession to the bar. Each man reached into his pocket, pulled out a few dollars, and placed it on the counter in front of Reggie. Jocks gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. As one, the entire team turned their backs on Reggie Vance with the same quiet. They melted back into the night, leaving behind an abyss of shame and a silence more damning than any shout could ever be. Reggie stood alone in the center of his shattered kingdom, a pile of crumpled dollar bills on the bar in front of him, the payment for his own destruction. He was surrounded by the disgusted stares of his clientele, the very people he had tried so desperately to impress, who now saw him for what he truly was, a small, hollow man in an empty, gilded cage. The moment the door closed behind the last seal, the spell of terrified silence was broken, but it was not replaced by the bar's former boisterousness. Instead, a wave of revulsion rippled through the room. The patrons who had witnessed the raw, well-dressed woman who had been sitting with Todd stood up abruptly, her face a mask of disgust. "I feel sick," she said to her companions, loud enough for Reggie to hear. She grabbed her purse and walked out without a backward glance. Her departure started an exodus. Couple by couple, group by group, the patrons began to leave, casting looks of contempt at the trembling owner. His kingdom was dissolving before his eyes, its foundations of arrogance washed away by a tide of silent honor. Todd, the instigator of the previous night's conflict, tried to slink away unnoticed, but several people glared at him as he passed. His face was flushed with shame. Then Sarah stepped forward. She had watched the entire reckoning with a mixture of fear, awe, and finally vindication. She untied the strings of her black apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the bar, right next to the pile of dollar bills. "I quit, Reggie," she said, her voice clear and strong. She had found her courage. She looked him in the eye, not with hatred, but with a kind of pity. "I can't work for a man like you." She turned and walked out into the cool night air, breathing freely for the first time in months. Outside, the SEAL team was gathered by their vehicles. The intense coiled energy from inside the bar had dissipated, replaced by a somber quiet. There was no celebration, no high fives, no triumphant laughter. They hadn't enjoyed destroying Reggie Vance. Their actions had been unnecessary, but grim. Duty a course correction for a moral compass gone awry. Jax walked over to Marcus and clapped a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. Marcus nodded, a slow, thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at the faces of his brothers, gathered in the dim light of the street, a silent wall of unwavering support. "I am now," he said, his voice filled with a gratitude that ran deeper than words. "Thank you." Jock simply nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. Their bond was their creed. "No one messes with our family." They climbed into their SUVs, and as quietly as they had arrived, they disappeared back into the city. Weeks turned into months. The story of that night spread through the city's service industry like wildfire. A cautionary tale whispered from one bartender and waitress to another. The gilded cage never recovered. The clientele dwindled to nothing. Eventually, a stark, white-closed sign was taped to the inside of the glass door, soon replaced by a larger, more permanent for-sale banner. The cage was empty. One bright Saturday afternoon, far from the shuttered remains of Reggie's failed dream, a different scene unfolded. In a public park, filled with the joyous shouts of children, Marcus Thorne stood on a freshly cut field. He was wearing a simple coach's polo shirt and a baseball cap, a whistle hanging around his neck. He was patiently explaining a play to a group of rambunctious 10-year-olds on a local soccer team, his face broken by a wide, easy smile. He was at peace, his immense strength now being used not to confront evil, but to build character, to foster teamwork. Of your voice, the price of your suit, or the arrogance of your opinions. It is not about aggression or the power to intimidate. Real strength is forged in the silent crucible of discipline. It is the quiet confidence of knowing your own worth, the unwavering integrity to stand by your principles, and the profound loyalty to stand for others. Respect is not a commodity to be bought or demanded. It is a reflection of one's own character, freely given. The story of Marcus Thorne and the fall of the Gilded Cage serves as a powerful reminder of this simple, unshakable truth. When you attack one member of a true brotherhood, you will inevitably face the collected strength of them all.